The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. $1.87. That was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved one or two at a time by penny pinching with the grocery clerk, vegetable man, and butcher. She was embarrassed to have been so cheap. Della counted the money 3 times. It was still only $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing she could do except for flop down on her shabby little couch and cry. So she did. In fact, life instigates sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. Now, while Della's cries are subsiding from sobbing to sniffling, she takes a look at her home where she lives. It is an apartment with furniture for only $8 per week rent. It is hard to describe so little, but her apartment is not much better looking than being homeless. In the vestibule, the mailbox next to the door was old and falling apart. The doorbell did not work. Next to the door was a card that had the name of her husband, Mr. James Dillingham Young. Back when James had earned $30 per week, the couple had included the middle name Dillingham because it was during a period of prosperity. But now that James was only earning a meager $20 a week, the name should be shortened to just Mr. James D. Young. Even still, every evening after work when James came home to his upstairs apartment, Della rushed to hug him. It was just the two of them. It didn't matter what the card read. Della called him Jim, and that was just fine. Della finally stopped crying and washed her face. She put on some makeup on her cheeks, then she walked to the window and looked out to see a boring gray cat walking on top of a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and she only had $1.87 to buy Jim's present. She had been saving every penny she could for a month, and that is all she was able to save. Things always cost more than she thought they would, so here she was with $1.87 for Jim's present. She had daydreamed many times about the perfect gift for Jim. It should be something fancy and not common and valuable. But even a gift like that would not be as great as Jim. When Della looked in the cheap mirrored glass between the windows of her room, she could just barely see herself. It was very difficult because the glass was made of strips. If she looked at it just right, she was able to see herself pretty well, but only because she was so thin. Suddenly, Della turned around and looked at herself in the mirrored glass. Her eyes looked beautiful and sparkling, but her face already looked pale and white. She quickly pulled her long hair out of its bun and let it fall down over her shoulders. Now, Della and Jim had 2 possessions that they were both very proud of. The first thing they were proud of was Jim's gold watch that first belonged to Jim's grandfather, then Jim's father, before being passed down to Jim. The other thing they were both so proud of was Della's hair. It was so beautiful that if the Queen of Sheba lived in the apartment across the hall, Della would have let her hair hang out the window someday to dry just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. If King Solomon had been the apartment's janitor, he would have been jealous of Jim's watch every time he saw Jim with it. Della's beautiful hair had gotten so long that it shone like a cascade of brown waters. It was so long that it ended below her knee. It could almost take the place of her garments. She put her hair back up in a bun nervously and quickly. She cried a few tears, and they splashed down on the old red carpet. Della put on her old brown jacket and her old brown hat. Her skirt whirled, and her eyes still had the brilliant sparkle. She fluttered out the door and down the stairs onto the street. She stopped when she saw the sign that read, Madame Sofronie, hair goods of all kinds. Della ran up 1 flight of stairs, then stopped and panted, catching her breath. Madame Sofronie was a large and pale white woman. She did not look as fancy as her name. Will you buy my hair? Asked Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take off your hat and let me see what your hair looks like. Della's brown cascade of hair rippled down. $20, said Madame as she carefully held Della's hair in her hand. Hurry and cut it off, said Della. For the next 2 hours, Della joyfully shopped for Jim's present. Actually, to be honest, she was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She had found it at last. It had definitely been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores. She knew this because she had been to them all. It was simple yet elegant. It was a simple yet elegant platinum chain. One could tell by looking at it that it was worth a lot of money. It was even good enough to put Jim's watch on. As soon as she saw it, Della knew that she had to get it for Jim. The chain was just like Jim. They were both quiet and simple and important. She paid $21 for the chain and rushed home with only 87 cents left. With that chain on Jim's watch, he could take it out of his pocket to check the time, and anyone who saw it would be impressed. Jim wouldn't have to hide the leather strap on the watch or be embarrassed if someone saw him with it ever again. When Della arrived at home, her excitement had calmed and gave way to prudence. She heated her curling irons and went to work fixing the mess of hair that was left after she unselfishly sold it to buy Jim's gift. This was definitely not an easy thing to do. In 40 minutes, her hair was in tight curls close to her head. It made her look like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long and carefully, judging herself. If Jim doesn't kill me, she said to herself, as soon as he sees me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island girl. I had no choice. What could I have bought him with $1.87? At 7 o'clock, Della had the coffee ready and the frying pan was hot and ready to cook the pork chops. Jim was never late. Della played with the chain she bought for Jim and sat at the table near the door where Jim would come in. She heard him and knew he was almost to the door. Della felt very nervous. She had a habit of saying silent prayers for the simplest everyday things, so now she asked God to make Jim think she was still pretty. The door opened and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor Jim. He was only 22 years old and had a family to take care of. Della could see that he needed a new overcoat and he didn't have any gloves to keep his hands warm. Jim stopped suddenly at the door, as still as a hunting dog that smells its prey. He was staring at Della, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. This terrified her. He wasn't angry or surprised. It wasn't disapproval, nor horror, nor anything else she had feared. He just kept staring at her with an odd expression on his face. Jim, darling, she cried, don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold it because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It will grow out again. You aren't upset, are you? I just had to do it. My hair grows so fast anyways. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. Just wait until you see what a nice, beautiful gift I have for you. You've cut off your hair? Asked Jim laboriously. It was hard for Jim to speak, and he was still in disbelief that Della's hair was gone. I cut it off and sold it, said Della. Don't you still like me the same anyway? I'm me without my hair, ain't I? Jim looked around the room curiously. You say your hair is gone? Asked Jim, still dumbfounded. You don't need to look for the hair, said Della. It's sold, I tell you, sold and gone. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be nice to me because I sold my hair for you. Maybe you could count the number of hairs on my head. She went on with a sudden sweetness. But nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I start cooking the pork chops, Jim? Jim finally stopped staring, and he seemed to wake. He enfolded his arms around his Della. He stopped for 10 seconds and looked around with discreet scrutiny at some inconsequential object in the other direction. Whether you make $8 a week or $1 million a year, what's the difference? Someone smart, like a mathematician, would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. We'll talk about this again later on in the story. Jim pulled out a wrapped present from his coat pocket and threw it on the table. Don't misunderstand me, Dell, he said. I don't think that any haircut or shave or shampoo could make me love you any less. But if you unwrap your gift, you may see why I was surprised and upset about your hair." Nervously, Della opened her gift from Jim. Then she screamed with joy, and just like a hysterical woman, she started crying hysterical tears. Seeing Della so upset, Jim had to do some of his best comforting. For inside the present lay the combs, the set of combs, side and back, that Della had stared at and longed for so long in a Broadway window. The beautiful combs were made of pure tortoiseshell with jeweled rims, just the right color to wear in her beautiful hair that was now gone. They were expensive combs, she knew, and although she had loved the combs, she never thought that she might actually own them. And now that they were hers, the beautiful tresses that should have needed the coveted combs were gone. But she still hugged them to her chest and finally looked up with dim eyes and a smile. She said, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." Suddenly remembering something, Della leaped up like a startled cat and cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim hadn't seen his beautiful present yet. She held the gift out to him with her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash as bright and happy as Della felt at that moment. "Isn't it perfect, Jim? I searched all over town to find it. You'll have to check the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch so I can see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," he said, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep them for a while. They're too nice to use right now. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. So how about you start cooking these pork chops?" The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related it to you, the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these two were the wisest. Oh, all who give gifts and receive gifts, such as they are the wisest. Everywhere they are the wisest. They are the Magi's.